Hello, this is Colleen O'Hara with Pocatello Paranormal, and you are listening to Speaking of Spirits. On this episode, I'm going to share with you my haunted story. Hi, this is Colleen O'Hara with Pocatello Paranormal, and you're listening to Speaking of Spirits. I am asked a lot by people in the community that I work with how I got involved in the paranormal investigation world. I've been doing paranormal investigations for about, I would say, about 24 years now. And my story started quite young, actually, probably from birth. My mom was incredibly gifted paranormally. She was clairvoyant, she was psychic, she was an empath, she was a medium, she was everything on every ability, and was so since before I was born. She grew up going to the Magic Castle in Hollywood, California, where she learned from some of the most gifted mediums that worked there to hone her abilities and hone her craft. So this story is going to really focus on probably the most terrifying event of my life, and still bothers me to this day. So we were moving to the Sierra Nevadas when I was quite young, very, very young. And I think like first grade, I think. And my dad had flown over this little town and decided this is where we were moving. And so my father and mother and I one weekend drove up to this town and started looking for houses to buy. So we had gone to probably 2 or 3 homes, and they weren't, I guess, didn't have the right feel for my parents. And we were at the third and last home in their price range. And mountain town, mining town, mill town, wonderful place, beautiful place. And I'll never forget approaching the driveway, and my dad stopped the car, and the house was set back. There was kind of enormous lawns in front of the house, trees. It was beautiful, pine trees set up in the pines in the mountains. And the house sat kind of down slope, so it almost looked to me like the house was crouching. It always looked to me like the house was crouching, ready to spring forward. And that was my first memory of the house. And the one memory that haunts me today was the crouching house. So my mom didn't want to get out of the car. My dad, who was very well aware of all of her abilities, said, Dottie, get out of the car. And my mom, I'm sitting in the back seat, and I remember this exchange pretty vividly. My mom looks at him and said, Bob, I don't want to get out of the car because the house is already full. And he sighed in his typical dad exasperation sigh and said, Dottie, get out of the car. This is the only house we have left on the list, and it's the only house we can afford. Get out of the car. We're going to go look at the house. I remember driving down the driveway. My dad started rolling the car forward, and I was filled with dread. And I don't know if the dread was me picking up on my mother's emotions because I was born empathic, or if I knew instinctively that this was not a good house. I don't know. I was quite young, but I do remember the dread. We get out of the car. The property was just beautiful. We sat up on a hill. The house sat up on a hill in the pines. We were surrounded it was Apple Hill up in the Sierra Nevadas. And so there were apple orchards beyond the property line, intermixed with all the ponderosa pines. It was just a stunning property. And there was fruit trees all over on the property. It was just beautiful with the different lawns and gardens, and it was very nice. But I didn't want to go in the house. My mom didn't want to go in the house, but of course we went in the house. And the overwhelming feel for me when we walked through the door was one of being just, I guess, uncomfortable. I don't know how to explain it in the little kid's imagination, right? It just felt like there was a silence in the house that was overwhelming to me. My mom, of course, I could tell that she was having issues with the house right away. She was very hesitant. I could tell that she was looking at things that I couldn't see. And the house was empty. It wasn't furnished when we looked at it, and it was big, much bigger than the house that we were living in at the time. I think it was like 7 bedrooms or something like that. It was just a very, very large house. Had an enormous living room and dining room. It was large, and it would fit our family, and in the price range that my parents could afford, and it had like 3 or 5 acres, I can't remember. So, my dream of having horses was front and center. So it was going to work. And of course, my parents bought the house. So a few weeks later, we were moving in, and there was 3 bedrooms on the top floor. There was one large one that looked towards the fire lookout station, and I loved it. It was a neat view. The other 2 rooms on the other side of the top floor were 2 identical rooms, and oddly enough, one of them had a hospital bed in the room, and it was the kind of bed that you cranked to raise the headboard or head or the foot of the bed. So I thought that was really weird. And my brother wanted one of those rooms, and there was a bathroom in between. So, and both of those rooms were painted blood red, which was weird. And the one bedroom I wanted was kind of lemon yellow, and it was large, and it would house all of my various rabbit cages and pigeon cages and hamster cages. So I was always saving animals. So it was cold when we moved up there, and there was only one heat source in the whole house. This whole house was like almost 4,000 square feet, and there was only one heat source in the house, and it was a tiny little pot-bellied stove down in the living room, wood stove, and that was it for the whole house. So it was cold, and I remember putting my hamsters upstairs in their cage, and of course the pigeon with the broken wing I found the day we were moving upstairs in the cage, but we were all sleeping on the floor surrounding this pot-belly stove because we were so cold. So and then my grandmother, who lived with us, was hearing this weird noise in the middle of the night. Turned out when we all kind of huddled around my dad with the flashlight and we went upstairs, and it turned out to be the hamsters on their wheel, and they were acting frenzied. So to quiet them down, we brought the hamsters and the pigeon in their cages downstairs and put them by the pot-bellied stove. So growing up, days go on, years go on, and none of the dogs, we always had just like lots of dogs growing up. They seemed to find our family, and we just kept them forever. And we had dogs. They always were either in the house or out of the house. They weren't just house dogs. They wouldn't go upstairs. None of those dogs would go upstairs. And it didn't take but maybe a month or two of living in that room upstairs that I decided to move downstairs at the bottom of the stairs to a different room. I didn't like the feel of being upstairs, and the dogs would never go upstairs, and a couple of them always slept in my room. So I chose a downstairs bedroom that the dogs were comfortable in. My dad, he was a cartoonist at the time, and he was also in the Air Force. He was also in the Air National Guard. So he had a studio in the house in one of the bedrooms, so I could watch him cartooning when he was home. And then his day job was working with the Air National Guard in Sacramento. And my mother was a police officer for the police department in town. So, very busy lives. We had a lot of odd things that happened in that house. A lot of the things that my dad didn't acknowledge until later on in life. But we had things that would go missing on a more regular basis. You could set your car keys down on the table and walk out of the room. 2 hours later, come back in the room, the car keys would be gone. Everybody'd be tearing the house apart, and you'd find him in the like a random location, like sitting in the oven or, I don't know, in a bathtub. I mean, just stuff like that happened on a regular basis. We had a number of friends come over to the house that one lady in particular, her name was Dorothy, and she was a medium. And my mom and Dorothy's husband, Big John is what we called him, and occasionally my dad would see an old lady walk through the house in a long, like, dressing gown with her hair tied up in a bun, kind of loosely tied in a bun, like she was getting ready to go to sleep and tied her hair up. But she would walk through the house and she would tuck me in. She'd come into my bedroom and tuck me in. Now, because we had so many bedrooms, I moved bedrooms a couple of times in this house, and the old lady always found me. I never saw her, but my parents saw her, mostly my mother, but occasionally my dad. And then we, like I said, had numerous friends that would see the old lady in the house. They would say, "Hey, who's the old lady just walked through the hall?" And my mom would say, "Oh, that's," they called her a name, probably, that's Doris. She's going to tuck in my daughter, Colleen. So, and I guess they must have thought at the time she was maybe a real person because she presented herself as a real person. So we had that going on. We had movement of stuff. Occasionally you'd come into the kitchen and all the drawers would be open, or all the cupboard doors would be open, or you could hear every door in the house shut at the same time, or just whispers. A lot of us. Now I have to say that my brother, I called him the dead zone. He didn't hear anything. He never experienced anything. He never thought anything was unusual. But there are some people that I believe kind of block everything. They're like shields. And I think that might have been him. My dad would experience particularly the moving things and the drawers opening and the doors closing. He would experience all of that, but somehow he seemed to rationalize it in his head like this isn't paranormal. But my mom knew what it was, and she interacted with many, many people that came to see her as a medium. They would find her, they would come into the house, and she would deal with them. And she would do it fairly quietly, but she would always deal with them. My mom also, and Dorothy, also had numerous seances. You have to remember that that's how my mom was trained. So seance, right, isn't any different than me communicating with the dowsing rods when I do my investigations. That was my mom's tool. The dowsing rods are my tool. So life goes on in this house. A few years go by. Several years go by. I'm probably 11 years old or so. and my dad was running for supervisor of our county. And so they were gone. He and my mother were gone a lot in the evenings campaigning. More drinking parties. I think that's more what they were, but it was all in the name of campaigning. So dinner and drink somewhere. And all through the years, all of this stuff had happened in the house, but there was always the feeling to me that there was something very negative in the house. If there was, my mother never spoke to me about it because, of course, I was young and she didn't want me to freak out any more than I was already at times freaked out about this house. I was alone a lot in the house, and there were certain areas of the house that I just didn't like to go. My dad had built a little barn, and I had horses at the time, and I spent most of my time outside with them, particularly when no one else was home, because the house bothered me. It always did. So this particular night, I'll never forget it. I still experience it. I still dream about it. I still remember the sounds of that night. I still remember the fear, the noises, the wind, everything about that night. So my parents were, like I said, they were campaigning. So it was my brother, who was 5 years older than me, had one of his friends over named Tim, and they wouldn't hang out with me. Of course, I was 5 years younger. You don't want to hang out with a kid. So they were upstairs, and God knows what they were doing. I don't think I want to know what teenage boys do up there. But anyway, I did years later find a cassette tape of them lighting their farts. So I know what they were doing. But anyway, I digress. So I was downstairs. Randy's room was above me. My brother's room was above me. And then there's the staircase. The stairs, the only stairs up to the upstairs, the stairs that the dogs would never go up. Even if you picked up a dog and took them upstairs, they would quickly come back down. That upstairs was just not a comfortable place. Other than for my brother. Like I said, he just never experienced anything. He never felt anything odd or out of place. He never saw anything. Just things never happened to him. So my brother and Tim were upstairs. I was downstairs, and I could hear the stereo playing upstairs. So this is the 70s. And they're listening to rock and, laughing and doing what guys do, and I'm probably downstairs reading or doing something. And it's late. I'd say it's 11 o'clock at night, which I consider late for kids, right? Parents are gone. They're going to be home. No cell phones at this time. We had a phone. My dad had made a really cool phone booth underneath the stairs. I went upstairs. So it was like a real phone booth with the light that would go on when you'd shut the door. And it had a bench, and it was just really cool. It was a neat phone booth. You could sit in there. And and it wasn't very big, like one person sized phone booth, like they typically are. So I had at the time taken the door off my bedroom, and I had glass beads for my doorway, and they were alternating pink and white. And most of the dogs were outside. I think maybe all of the dogs were outside. I was in my bed, and I was reading, listening to them. And all of a sudden, I think I see something walk by my doorway really quick. And I know something had walked by it, but it wasn't a cat. I mean, it was human height, like dad height, right? So, 5'11" or so, my dad's height. And the glass beads very faintly moved on the door. And not enough to really make them clack together, but enough that I could tell there was air movement by my bedroom door. And I thought, well, that's weird. Did I just imagine it? So I looked at the beads a little bit, and I had that tiny little creep of fear. that comes up on you and you're trying to squash it down and rationalize what you just saw or heard. And I'm laying there, and once again, this time more clearly because I'm looking at the door, I'm not reading the book, I see something walk by my door, and it seemed like human, but it was all black. And now this time the beads clinkle a little more. And my thought was, there's somebody in the house. Because at that time, we didn't even own house keys. You never opened or locked your doors. There's like 4 doors to the outside on this house, and they're all unlocked. And we're in the mountains, and we're alone. And, there's no, of course I could call the police department where my mother worked, and they could get a hold of the sheriff's department and have somebody come up. But that's not what I'm thinking at the time as a child. I'm laying there. And I'm like, somebody just walked by my door. There's somebody in this house. Now, the music's still going on upstairs, so the boys are completely unaware of what's happening here. So I have to get the courage to leave my room or lock myself in my closet. And my closet was not a place that I wanted to lock myself into. So I have to somehow let Tim and Randy know that there's somebody in this house. And I'm hearing footsteps. And so the house was built so you could go down the hallway and keep going into my parents' room, or you could make a right into the dining room, and then make a right into the kitchen, and then make a right into the breakfast area, and then make a right into the hallway again that goes by the stairs. And I'm hearing footsteps kind of like walking back and forth in that kitchen breakfast nook area. So it's really close to my bedroom. And I'm thinking again, somebody's in this house. Somehow I have to muster the courage to leave my bedroom, in which those glass beads are really going to make a lot of noise because there's no way of getting through those quietly, and get the heck up those stairs and into my brother's room to let him know somebody's in the house. And I'm thinking the whole time, when I'm doing this, whoever's in this house is going to get me. I mean, there's just no way for me to do this quick enough. So I'm laying there and I'm just shaking in fear. But I don't want to be alone downstairs. So I finally mustered the courage to bolt through those glass beads and catty-cornered up those stairs and into my brother's room, where there's no way I could do this quietly. So I might as well just do it. So I did. And I get upstairs and my brother turns off the TV, and he's like mad at me for interrupting him and Tim and whatever antics they were up to. And he sees me shaking and he's like, "What's happening? What's going on?" I said, "Randy, somebody's in the house. There's somebody downstairs in the house." So immediately he and Tim are like, oh, okay. So his first thought is, we need to get to the shotguns, which are downstairs. Now, I want you to back up a little bit in time. This is prior to, kids taking guns to schools. This is prior to all of this violence that we experience today, right? Everybody in our school and in our high school, all the boys drove trucks with gun racks, and half the girls did too. And we all had a rifle or a shotgun in our trucks. Now, I, of course, was a little too young for that, but this was a mountain community. All the kids still hunt, and all the kids had guns, rifles or shotguns in their vehicles. My brother was no exception to this. So, and because my parents were both cops, my dad wasn't any longer, but they were both at one time. My mom still is. We were taken to the range regularly. We were taught how to assemble and disassemble a weapon. We were taught how to clean weapons, shoot weapons, how to store weapons. And the theory was at the time, and still is for a lot of people, especially in law enforcement families, I would imagine, that there's an unloaded gun is a useless gun. What are you going to do? Throw it? So we had weapons in our house, and they were all locked and loaded, ready to go, but we never touched them. And neither did our friends, because all of our friends grew up with weapons, and they were all taught how to handle guns safely and properly. So nobody ever messed with anybody's guns. If you're at your house or somebody else's house, we just never touched them. The mystique was gone We hated them because we were constantly having to go to the range. So our thought was, or Randy's thought was at the time, and Tim, they were both discussing this, and because they had turned the stereo off and we're upstairs, we could hear faint footsteps in the house. So they're like, oh God, somebody is downstairs. We better get to the guns. You know, they wanted to at least get the rifles, not the handguns, get a rifle into their hands, and so we could protect ourselves. And then our thought was, what are we going to do? We don't have a phone number as to where our parents are. We probably did, but I think we were too scared to remember where they put it, because they used to put everything in the little phone booth on a notepad. But we thought, who could we call at this late hour who could come over to our house and be with us until the parents got home? So very quietly, all three of us go downstairs, and we stop in the stairway, and we're listening, and we could hear movement, this time more in the living room. So we thought, okay, we could sneak around to where one of the gun cabinets was and at least get a couple of rifles. So as we're trying to do that, we're going one direction in that loop of dining room, kitchen, breakfast nook, hallway, and we can hear the footsteps coming around, so there's no way we're going to be able to get to those weapons. So it's like it started following us, and we get into the dining room, and now it's in the hallway. And we're like, oh my God, what are we going to do? So all three of us crammed into that phone booth underneath the stairs. And my brother frantically, we don't shut the door, because if you shut the door all the way, the light comes on, because that's the way phone booths work, right? So we close the door as much as we can without that light, hoping that whoever's in the house doesn't know that we're crammed into this phone booth. And my brother gets on the phone and very quietly calls one of our neighbors down the road. Now, this isn't a neighborhood. These are not houses stacked up on each other. These are spread out houses on a one-line road that's dead end, where you know all your neighbors, because there's maybe 6 houses or 10 houses on this little mountain road. So my brother calls one of our neighbors and asks him to come over and says, look, we think there's somebody in the house. So he says he's going to come right over. Of course, we've wakened him up at this time. He comes, but he's in his truck and he's coming down the driveway as fast as we could even hang up the phone. So he's coming down the driveway. I hear him come through the front door, and he's got a shotgun. He says it. He announces it. Whoever's in this house, blah, blah, blah. So he starts going through the house, and he clears the house, right? So he goes room by room by room by room, upstairs, downstairs. There's no one. He can find no one. And he tells us to come out because he knows we're hiding in the phone booth. He goes, guys, come on out here. Let's just sit in the living room, and I'm going to stay with you until your parents come home. So we're sitting, and I just remember this incredibly long couch that we had at the time. Like, you could sit like 5 adults on this thing. So we're all sitting on the couch with the guy's name is Bob that came over to the house. He's sitting kind of in the middle of us, and he's got a shotgun, across his knees. And we have some lamps on in the living room, of course, and he's sitting there. And we're very quiet because we're still scared. Because even though Randy has never experienced anything in this house, and I don't know if Tim ever has, he understands that there's stuff that goes on in this house he's just not aware of. And he's looking at me, and my hair's standing up on my arms, and I'm sitting there, and I'm shaking for everything. I mean, I'm like shaking, like I'm frozen shaking. And I'm looking at him, and we're kind of making eye contact, and Tim's looking at me, and Tim knows what goes on in this house too. And I know it's still here. It's still here. And all of a sudden I look down at Bob's legs where he has the shotgun. And he's got both hands on the shotgun, and the shotgun's laying sideways, right? So it's not pointing at anybody. And I'm looking down at Bob's legs, and all of a sudden they're shaking a little bit. And his hands are shaking on that shotgun, so there's a little bit of a rattle going on there. And he's shaking a little more and a little more. And he's not saying anything. He's just looking straight out that living room window into the trees. And he's not looking at us, and he's not saying a word, and he's shaking harder and harder and harder. And we're all just sitting there. And I'm shaking, Bob's shaking, Randy and Tim are just like terrified. And we're all on this couch. And the feeling of overwhelming terror is there. We're all sitting there. It wasn't probably 20 minutes we all sat there like this. Bob's like almost sweaty. When my parents' headlights come down the driveway, they get out. You could hear the dogs. Yeah, they're all happy. And my dad and my mom come through that door and they see Bob sitting there with us with the shotgun. And my dad's first reaction is, what the hell just happened? What is going on in here? And Bob stands up. Now, my dad's name is Bob, too. And he stands up and he says, I don't know what the hell is in this house, but I'm never coming back here. And he bolts out that door, leaving my dad and my mom absolutely like stumped as to what they just witnessed. And that's when my mom and my dad sat down with us and tried to calm us down. And when my mom started walking through the house, cleansing and clearing the house like she would do on a very regular basis to get that atmosphere calmed down to where we could relax. My dad still is just like completely unnerved by what he witnessed, right? A neighbor sitting there with his kids with the shotgun. We're all terrified. And it took some doing for my mom to explain to my dad, this was not human that was in the house. This thing that would come and go through our house was not a human. It's not the ghost of somebody undead. Or dead, right? It's not just a normal spirit like we had constantly in the house. This was a non-human, and she's experienced it several times in this house. And she had tried to explain to him over and over again how she wanted to leave the house, but they couldn't. I mean, they had everything invested in this house. They couldn't just leave. My dad, it was kind of funny, not funny, haha. After that event, things started going really, really wrong for our family. And then my parents ended up getting a divorce. And it wasn't until so I was 12 when the divorce came through, right? I'm 56 now. So it wasn't until maybe 10 years ago, I'm with my dad at the airport where one of his planes was, and we were walking the runway like we usually would because, it's a very quiet airport, especially early in the morning. There's no traffic coming and going out of there. So he would walk the runway. And I was walking the runway with him, and he stopped and he said, you understand that house caused our divorce? That what went on there caused our divorce? And I thought, wow, you finally acknowledged it after all of these years. You finally acknowledged that the events in that house tore our family apart. And I said, yeah, Dad, I know. He said, if it wasn't for that house, your mother and I probably would still be married. And I just kind of took my breath away. So as my dad got closer and closer towards the end of his life, he opened up more and more and more about things that I didn't know that had gone on in that house that my mom would tell him, and my dad would just dismiss it. And she was so furious because he was so dismissive, even when year after year after year she would say, hey, Bob, if you're going to go flying today, you might want to check that right aileron because I don't think it's going to work right. Sure enough, he'd get out to the airport and there would be a problem and he would have to fix it before taking off. Or your landing gear is not going to come down this weekend. I've dreamt it, so I want you to be prepared. Do your safety inspections. But she says, no matter what, the landing gear in this particular plane you're in is not coming down. Look for grass. And sure enough, it happened. So all of these events all through our lives, my mom knew. And she would tell him these things. And all of these things would happen. But he would always dismiss it. He was a very rational guy. But for him to finally acknowledge that, yeah, these paranormal events in this house caused the divorce, that night has influenced my life more than I could have imagined. I grew up with my mom's having all of these gifts. I didn't have all of those gifts, but I'm getting more and more and more as I age. And so when I work with families, I try to help maybe some of the family members not be so dismissive of the family members who are experiencing them, because not everybody across the board experiences paranormal activity the same or at all. There can be several members in the family, and maybe one or two are having the experiences and no one else is, and they don't understand it. Now my brother, who is like the shield, who never experienced anything, he experienced it that night, and Tim did as well. They heard the footsteps. They knew we were being followed. We thought by a human at the time, um, but it wasn't. So he hadn't really had any experiences after that, but that one night he did. So I just think it's really interesting how we experience things so differently, and how you can, I don't know if they're just natural blockers or they're just not in tune to paranormal activity, but people experience things on a different plane. Um, so don't be dismissive if you're not experiencing things and someone is. I mean, you never know when it's going to be your turn to experience it, and how that experience could shape the rest of your life. So anyway, that's just one of my stories. I hope you enjoyed it. And this is Colleen O'Hara, speaking of spirits, signing off.